Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar on the investor case for human rights. My name is Nicole Harmon. I'm a program manager with the Intentional Endowments Network, and I'm very pleased to have with me three great panelists to share their experience and expertise on this topic today. We'll be hearing from Josh Zinner, the CEO of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, abbreviated as ICCR. David Schilling, a senior program director focused on human rights and resources at ICCR, and Julie Tanner, the director of socially responsible investing at Christian Brothers Investment Services and an ICCR board member. After our panelist presentations, we'll spend the remainder of the hour in dialogue responding to your questions. So please enter your questions throughout the presentation in the chat function of the control panel at any time, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. This webinar is being recorded and will be distributed to all registrants by email, and will also be available on our website shortly after it's completed, so you can refer back to this conversation and share it with others. And we will also make the slides available upon request. So just briefly before we dive in, for those of you that aren't familiar with the Intentional Endowments Network, we're a nonprofit collaborative peer learning network with the goal of supporting endowments and enhancing performance by aligning investments with institutional mission, values, and sustainability goals. And we do this in a variety of ways, including hosting in-person forums and events, facilitating peer networking, curating useful resources on sustainable investing opportunities, and providing educational venues such as webinars like this one. We encourage you to stay engaged in these conversations after today's webinar. More information on IEN is available on our website, or you are welcome to reach out to us at any time. So with that, I will turn it over to Josh to get us started.
Thanks so much, Nicole. If you could go to the next slide. So I'm the CEO at ICCR, the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. ICCR started back in the early 70s when a group of faith-based investors got together to engage the companies they owned on disinvesting from apartheid South Africa. And from that moment, the shareholder engagement movement was born. And so ICCR members were really pioneers in bringing to the forefront environmental and social issues with companies as shareholders, and really through the years have been really out front as sort of a canaries in the coal mine, bringing risks, especially around social issues, to companies early on. We work very closely with key stakeholders like NGO allies, community-based groups, to make sure that the perspective of workers and communities is integrated into the shareholder engagement that we do, and to make sure that companies are focused not only on the bottom line, but also on the impacts that their operations have on communities. And so you see in the slide some examples of some of the shareholder advocacy that ICCR members have done through the years on critical human rights issues, doing extensive work around global supply chains. David will touch on some of that work later. And this really brings us to the discussion today, which is, first of all, how to make the investor case on human rights, and more importantly, how we can further build up the investor voice on critical human rights issues, what we can do and what you can do to increase our voice and to take action. Nicole, if you can move to the next slide, please. So it goes without saying today that human rights threats and business and human rights issues that crop up with companies are as acute as ever, particularly as the regulatory environment here in the US really erodes. It's even more critically important, since we don't have that regulatory foundation, to continue as investors to move companies forward on key human rights and labor rights issues, both as a lever for change and as investors. We're deeply concerned as long-term investors that companies maintain progress on human rights issues. it's important that we, our role as investors goes forward both to engage companies that are leaders and to bring along the companies that are laggards in this area. And this is a moment when we really can build our impact. Reputational risk is as sharper than ever, both negative and positive reputational risk, both because of the fractured political and cultural environment, but also the use of social media. And as investors, it's a moment in time when we can really make a strong business case with companies to do the right thing on a range of issues, both for the public good and for the long-term value of those companies that we hold. And next slide, please, Nicole. So today's webinar, Julie Tanner, who Nicole introduced earlier, she's a longtime leader amongst investors and focusing companies on human rights risks. And she's going to talk about the investor case for human rights, why it's so important for investors to be pressing companies on human rights issues. And we'll talk about some of the existing frameworks that are out there and some of the strategies that investors have taken in talking to companies about these risks. And then David Schilling, my colleague, who is a longtime leader of human rights work here amongst ICCR members, will talk about an exciting new initiative that we're building out at ICCR, the Investor Alliance for Human Rights. We see a real opportunity in this moment to broaden the base of investors that are working on human rights and to really strengthen the investor voice and investor leverage on critical human rights issues, both here in the US and globally. And we see this alliance as a hub where we can mobilize investors to engage on the business case with companies and to engage policymakers as well from an investor perspective on critical human rights issues, as an opportunity to coordinate actions with key stakeholders to build strength and to coordinate a rapid response mechanism for investors to address emerging human rights issues and crises. So you'll hear more about this later and what the goals, what this will look like and what the goals will be. But first, we'll turn it over to Julie to give some background on how investors have been engaging companies on human rights. Thanks, Julie.
Thank you, Josh. Preventing adverse human rights impacts is one of the most pressing challenges, and it affects just about every company around the world. It's also one of the core issues I focus on at Christian Brothers Investment Services. We invest for about 600 Catholic institutions around the globe. And it's also an important issue to me personally as well. I serve on several human rights focused boards, including ECPAT, which is working to prevent child sexual exploitation. So it's been very gratifying to see over the 35 years that Christian Brothers has been in business, that human rights, just is growing in increasing importance across a vast range of business stakeholders. And companies that have comprehensive human rights frameworks in place is plainly better positioned to gain social license to operate, have their investments welcomed by communities, unions, or governments, and have operations accepted by communities. In contrast, companies associated with human rights abuses may expose themselves, as you all know, to reputational damage, negative press coverage, brand damage, project delays or cancellations, inability to expand, divestment, loss of financing, costly lawsuits or fines. And, I put together this slide. It's sort of a mixture of companies that I've worked on across the range of these issues over the past 10 years. And, you can also see related to laws and regulations, just for example, in the US and UK, now you require companies to disclose their efforts, for example, to eradicate forced labor within their supply chains. And worldwide, other transparency measures, are similarly gaining momentum, including in Australia, where they're working on a bill similar to the UK's Modern Slavery Act. But you can see this range of risks that companies face and that investors face. Frankly, I've had conversations with clients who, once, I'm sure this has probably happened to you as well, where they may see that you're invested in a particular company and note that this company has recently been involved in some human rights controversy, and why are you holding shares in that company, and how can you demonstrate to that investor that you're taking action? So companies are not only expected to meet their responsibilities, but clearly face a variety of consequences if they don't. Now, the ones that I've listed here in terms of risk, that's just a small sample. But clearly there's many other risks that companies face. So just as an example, Newmont Mining, the world's second largest gold miner, last year announced it was walking away from its $5 billion Conga copper and gold project in Peru. I led an engagement with members of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility for 7 years on that company. And they had to walk away from that mine after years of relentless and widely publicized community opposition to its operations, from concerns related to water, indigenous rights, lack of engagement, lack of community investment to a sufficient extent. And in its annual SEC filing, it said, due to the current social and political conditions, the company didn't anticipate being able to develop the mine for the foreseeable future. And Conga had the potential to generate up to 350,000 ounces of gold and 120 million pounds of copper a year during its 19-year life. So you can see the cost that this had, to Newmont. Other recent cases you may be aware of involving names like Nestle, Costco, Walmart, Thai Union, and other companies regarding forced labor, a global problem affecting many industries, and it's one of several human rights risks that can have widespread impacts on companies' operations and business development. And as you may have seen, the International Labor Organization, ILO, they've reported 24.9 million people are victims of forced labor. That number just came out recently. And in particular, the palm oil and fishing industries in Asia, as well as construction projects in the Middle East, are examples of high-risk sectors. So over the past 3 years, major media articles widely disseminated, detailed egregious instances of forced labor and child labor in the seafood supply chain in Thailand, where men hauling fish ground for fish meal have been out on boats for weeks and months at a time, subjected to abuse, deceived into jobs, operating in a country with weak laws and enforcement. So you have another example of headline risk. Lawsuits were also filed against Costco, Nestle, Mars, and their Thai exporters. Extensive investment by some of these companies into their supply chain monitoring has occurred since then, and some of those companies have taken leadership positions with the help of major NGOs and some multi-stakeholder initiatives. But you can see that some of these risks are clearly causing financial concern and also reputational risk to these companies, as well as the host of other risks that are displayed there. So companies own operations, and those operations, products, or services of its business partners through its business relationships can have negative impacts on human rights, which in turn can affect reputation and financial and investment performance. So risks aren't isolated as they're presented, in this graphic. In many cases, they work in concert. So to understand and manage these risks, a company needs to carry out human rights due diligence. And that's really, I think, at the core of some of the comments I'm going to make today. This is the first element of the UN guiding principles, expectation that companies should know and show what their potential human rights impacts are. I'm going to talk about the guiding principles in a minute, but just as it relates to risk, and we just talked about some of these basic elements of risk and examples, just a point that you'll also need to look at asset classes and investment types, because as you know, certain risks will differ based on the type of investment. If it's an investment in real estate, that may have specific risks related to land acquisition. There may be issues associated with that related to displacement, vulnerable populations. Similarly, investments in agribusiness may have different types of risks. So looking at the sector, the countries of operations and the regions, and whether the risk could be sovereign debt by supporting undemocratic regimes that can foster human rights abuses, may also lead to different types of conversations. But it's not just about risk. Human rights is a basic notion. People have a right to be treated with dignity. It's not something that's just about what governments or what businesses can give or take. It's really the foundation for leading a decent human life. So human rights are inherent to all people as human beings. So sometimes, I think sometimes focus on the financials and focus on the risk, and really sometimes I find what's some of the most effective conversations that I can have with companies is really about people and looking at this issue of dignity and living a decent life. So companies can demonstrate they're actively taking steps to determine and address human rights risks to people and their related reputational, financial, and operational risks to the company by sharing with investors their human rights due diligence processes and how they're incorporated into a company's overall risk management system. And this is really paramount. But assessing corporate performance and companies, how they're addressing it and reducing risk is very challenging. So you'll see on the next slide, I've tried to provide some tools and resources because I think investors increasingly are recognizing that the lack of reliable, accessible information about human rights performance of companies is hindering the ability to manage medium to long-term risks. And I know it's definitely a cause of concern in my shop and something we talk about with our colleagues at the trade associations, at CIF, at ICCR, and PRI. It's a constant sort of uphill battle, but it's getting better. I think sometimes it's difficult, of course, hard to measure companies' real-world effects, not just their efforts. And also, social measurement, some cases evaluates what is convenient, not always what is most meaningful. And the lack of consistent standards is another challenge, also getting better. So lack of reliable, accessible information, hard to measure in terms of real-world effects, not just efforts. Lack of standards and measuring what is most meaningful is something we really strive for. So as investors, we understand at a minimum whether companies we have invested in have the appropriate policies and processes in place to identify, assess, and manage human rights impacts. And with these policies and processes in place, companies should be better able to identify and manage relevant human rights challenges and opportunities. And, I came across something Mary Robinson, former United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and former president of Ireland, had said, and she had made a comment that when the target is human rights, mere rhetoric is not adequate to the task at hand, and what's needed are solid methodologies, careful techniques, and effective mechanisms to get the job done. So on this slide, I've tried to provide some of that, tools, reports, and rankings. And it's critical that we receive information. I mean, the meta study I'd seen noted recently in an Ernst & Young report of more than 200 academic studies, industry reports, newspaper articles, and books from the University of Oxford and Arabesque Asset Management showed that 88% of research found that solid ESG practices resulted in better operational performance, and 80% found that it has a positive influence on stock price performance. And the study considers the collective ESG performance, but also the individual impact of good E, S, and G management. So by fostering more disclosure, we can help to better understand this as investors. It'll be really useful for us. So you'll see on this, I started with the most important of all documents, which is the UN Guiding Principles, set of guidelines for states and companies to prevent, address, and remedy human rights abuses committed in business operations. They really provide an authoritative global standard for preventing and addressing risk. And as you likely know, there's 3 aspects to them about avoid causing or contributing to adverse human rights impacts, seeking to prevent or mitigate impacts, even if they've not contributed to those impacts, and really focusing on the risk to people, not just the risk to business. I think sometimes that's always a interesting part of the conversation. Sometimes when I'm talking with companies, is that sometimes lost, is it's always considered to be this risk to the company. Well, it's really about the risk to people. So that is a core tool. And SHIFT has a project of SHIFT is UN Guiding Principles Reporting Framework. So I definitely recommend looking at that. It's considered first comprehensive guidance for companies to report on how they respect human rights. So I think that's a core document to look at. Also wanted to call your attention to the UNPRI, the Principles for Responsible Investment, an international network of investors working together to put 6 principles, PRI, into practice. And one of their work streams relates to human rights. And there has been a lot of work, more needs to be done, but there has been some substantive work going on, including a 2015 engagement guide, Human Rights in the Extractive Industry, and also engagements and a guide on forced labor in the agricultural supply chain. So if you're members of PRI, I encourage you to either join or look at those tools, because when you look through this list, you see it really takes a village on their own. You can't just get by with getting enough information from one of them, but altogether you can get a very good picture and have some good indicators and tools on how to assess. And I think an important thing to look at, of course, is GRI. There's 23,000 GRI reports that GRI has in the database right now. And it was interesting, of the 250 companies, the world's largest companies, 92% report on their sustainability performance, and 74% of those use GRI's sustainability reporting standards. So this is really what most of the companies are using. And the 400 series of the GRI standards include topic-specific standards related to child labor, diversity, rights of indigenous peoples, freedom of association. So you'll want to, dig in and look at that. The other thing I think that's very exciting is the corporate human rights benchmark. 3 high-risk industries, 98 companies altogether. So the benchmark was created to provide a comparative snapshot year on year of the largest companies on the world, looking at their policies, practices, and processes as it relates to human rights. And it's fantastic. It's a collaboration that was led by investors and civil society organizations. I know CBIS, ICCR were part of the group providing input to that, and it was created by Aviva, IRIS, APG, IHRB, among others. But you can look at their latest results across 3 sectors. I pulled up the just to see and be able to share with you, and I will tell you in the sectors that they're looking at, which are the extractive sector, agricultural products, and apparel. Those are the 3 sectors they're analyzing, looking at 100 companies. And the top 6 companies that scored the best were BHP Billiton in extractives, Marks and Spencer, Rio Tinto, Nestle, Adidas, and Unilever. And the corporate human rights benchmark looks at governance and policies, embedding respect and human rights due diligence, looks at responses to serious allegations. So it provides a good framework to assess a company. The other tool that I really like, I'll just mention, is Know the Chain. Know the Chain is a partnership between Humanity United, Business and Human Rights Resource Center, Sustainalytics, and Verite, and they're ranking corporate efforts to eradicate forced labor from their global supply chain. They have excellent tools on there. You'll see dedicated resources for investors. They have a investor engagement guide that is very helpful, and it's exciting because they benchmark about 60 companies on their efforts across 3 different sectors. They're looking at food and beverage, apparel and footwear, and electronics. But they just announced they're going to assess another 125 companies, which is very exciting. And just pulled the recent data just to share with you. So food and beverage companies that scored the best on their efforts were Unilever, Coke, and Nestle, which we see Nestle coming up there, and Unilever as well from Corporate Human Rights Benchmark. In the ICT sector, Hewlett-Packard, HP, Apple, and Intel. And apparel and footwear, Adidas, Gap, and H&M scored the highest. And they look at things like supply chain standards, traceability, worker voice. So that's a great thing to look at. I'll also give a shout out to the Danish Institute for Human Rights. There's some great guides about the Human Rights Guide to the Sustainable Development Goals. That's very good. And they also did an impact assessment guidance toolbox. And, you know, I'm always very high on ICCR. They have papers and roundtables on ethical recruitment. Check their website. They're invaluable in terms of trying to help companies work on the issue of forced labor. If you look to the next slide, the asks of companies, you'll see this list on what we're asking, and it really starts with this human rights due diligence process. It's so important. It's fundamental to implementing the responsibility to respect because it's the process through which the companies know and show. So talking to companies and discussing the elements of the guiding principles on human rights due diligence will be very important. I've outlined just some of the core, you know, questions here. Each one of these could be engagement over the course of years with companies, because really trying to understand how the company's due diligence process enables it to manage the complexity of its business environment, including its business relationships, conflict zones, countries with poor human rights records, emerging markets. I mean, it's just one among so many criteria. And I think importantly, and we've seen this in other investor initiatives going on, whether it's proxy access or Larry Fink from BlackRock's letter to companies, is really looking at the board and what is the leadership at the company? What are they saying and how are they working on this issue? Is there board expertise on human rights? I think this is going to be a growing call among investors to try to look at board members, at board committees, and how this is being assessed. So you'll see some of the questions that are listed here, you know, relate to some of the competencies and how is a CEO or how are staff incented to work on this issue? How are they trained? So looking at internal frameworks, and then looking at actual policies. Is the company repaying workers once it finds workers have paid for jobs and are then subject to debt bondage? Is the company evaluating high-risk sectors and regions? Are they tracing back to core materials? Is the company involved in any public-private partnerships? How is the company engaged with local law enforcement, local and national NGOs? These are all just examples of questions that I think can help get to better understanding as to how the company is addressing the issue and understanding what, if any, comprehensive frameworks exist. If you go to the next slide, I just wanted to quickly just touch on a couple of initiatives that CBIS has worked on, in some cases in conjunction with other socially responsible investors and faith investors at USCIF and at ICCR, and some instances with the PRI, because I really do think it takes a village and it takes all of us working together. So I hope those of you on the phone, I would love to work with you, and through ICCR or PRI or other ways. But I think so many instances, our collective work has been significant and has been impactful. One of the things that I think a lot of investors have worked on well together has been trying to find multi-pronged ways to address human rights risks and issues. And one of those ways is through legislation I'd mentioned before, but the California Transparency and Supply Chain Law, and efforts at the federal level. Investors worked on that. ICCR, Calvert, and Christian Brothers spearheaded an effort that had investors with over $1 trillion writing to Congress and calling for legislation that would force companies to disclose steps they were taking to address human trafficking. And in conjunction with that, there was congressional briefings and investor guidance that we published. Also, additional sign-on letters that were circulated. And I think efforts that are multi-pronged and help us work together can help to demonstrate our concern in a variety of ways, in addition to going towards directly with companies. And I think this has been demonstrated in a variety of ways. I know I worked with ICCR again on an effort called Celebration Without Exploitation that looked at the issue of forced labor in association with mega sporting events. And again, it was a cross-border coalition of investors and civil society groups. But just wanted to give you a whirlwind tour of one of the ways that CBIS is working on the issue, in many cases in consultation with partners. And I'd be happy to share some of the research and resources I mentioned with specific links with Nicole later. But thanks so much for your time. I'm going to turn it over to my hero and mentor, David Schilling.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. This has been really helpful, Julie. I think, so first I'd like to say a big thanks to the Intentional Endowment Network. Nicole, when you put up the slide as to what you're doing and what we have been doing and plan to do as we're building this Investor Alliance for Human Rights, there is so much synergy, because a lot of it really we're in the same universe. And I do look forward to engagement, involvement, and really, concretely, collaborating to build the kind of, network in terms of human rights that we have seen so effectively in the environmental space as investors and other groups have really come together to galvanize not only analysis, but action and change. So let me just briefly describe what we see as this Investor Alliance for Human Rights. Already we've discussed the need and the opportunities. I think I would just simply say that there is really, a convergence now, I think, between, some of the companies that are really understanding their human rights responsibility, respect human rights, but also they're seeing a changing market where they're getting feedback from millennials and other consumers that care about a range of things, not just low prices, but also, the environmental impact, the human rights impact, labor impact in the products that are being sold. So I think the issue of the need, increasingly everywhere I go, the kind of catchword is collective action. So even, a week ago, we were meeting with Walmart in Bentonville, Arkansas. They are a huge company and have recognized that if they're going to make any progress, they need to collaborate and they need to work with their sector. So they become much more active with Consumer Goods Forum in Paris, with the new social sustainability pillar that has really focused in on forced labor, ethical recruitment, but they do a range of issues. If you look at investors, I think large investors that are looking at the whole landscape recognize that in order to have more collective impact, there needs to be a coming together. And that's getting reinforced by a number of the things that Julie talked about in terms of the disclosure regimes that are emerging. Let's face it, the Modern Slavery Act in the UK has really raised the awareness of listed companies related to their obligations around a range of things related to slavery, forced labor, and have begun to report. So that gives investors a snapshot into what companies are doing. Some of those are very weak, but it's a yearly disclosure, and it needs to be approved at the board level. So it's not just something nice you put on your website. There's going to be some accountabilities going forward. So I think for a whole range of reasons, this is an important time to sort of, galvanize the investor human rights perspective. There's been a lot that's gone on, but I think, collectively we can do a lot more. Plus, you see the opportunities. There's the opportunities of companies that recognize that they have a greater place in, some parts of the market if they're really tracking their human rights due diligence. And it's not like every single, consumer or investor is asking that question right now, but more and more are looking at the overall performance of a company, social, environmental, and governance. I think the other piece is that this is going to grow. I mean, actually this month, those companies operating in the EU, the EU non-financial disclosures directive has come into force, and we're going to be seeing other examples of, companies really needing to address non-financial issues, including human rights. Next slide, please. So what are we talking about? I think we're just going to give you the basic framework. Certainly the collective action platform encompasses the entire alliance that we're building. We announced that we were going to build this in October, and we have been putting in place the pieces. We've hired staff that'll be starting in a week. We've been doing outreach to a variety of investor groups. There's been a lot of interest in this, and now we're really looking at, okay, let's make sure that we're doing this in a way that really addresses not only the needs of investors, but amplifying our collective voice. So clearly there's institutional investors, there's so many different segments to the investor community, but institutional investors are, let's say, at different stages related to incorporating human rights into their criteria of investment and into their assessment of their publicly traded companies. So I think we need to have a clear understanding that so many of the resources, for example, Julie, that you mentioned, there needs to be some education of investors that are just beginning to get a handle on these issues. So to craft, some, clear talking points, some clear documents that kind of can distill so much of what is happening in a variety of arenas and really try to meet that basic need to get a handle on the education, particularly of those institutional investors that are just coming to the human rights space, but they may have been really focused on environmental governance and really are wanting to join in on this initiative. There are so many human rights risks and human rights issues. So we anticipate like a collective, collaborative hub where there's a prioritization of some of the, the high risk issues. And we have analyses that have obviously grown up under the UN Guiding Principles, Business Human Rights shift, as Julie mentioned, where you have concepts of like salience, where what are the salient human rights risks of a given company or a given sector based on its core business? What are the key impacts? And I think that's going to be helpful because we're not all starting the same place. We're building on a range of work that's been done, but we're not all starting the same place. And I think the second, which has been talked about already, is strengthening the business case. The business case clearly, in the case of some of the human rights issues, overlaps into the moral. And we've heard companies describe their business case for working on a range of high-risk issues like foreign migrant workers into their supply chain or their bottling system. And it's, clearly it's as much moral as business, but it has a business component. How do we articulate that more carefully, given the specific salience of issues with a given company or sector? And when that can be shared amongst a range of investors, it's really developing those strategies that can carry out the sort of the prioritization of the human rights risk and build an action plan. And I think it's fair to say that the assumption of this alliance is not about only, we create, a list of priorities. Every institution is not going to be involved in everything. But I think, in involvement in a number of aspects of the alliance will help the whole. The platform for rapid response, clearly a number of investors have done this already. We have recently, actually December 21, sent a letter. This was on the disclosure requirements of the conflict minerals, the 1502 Dodd-Frank section, and that's been under challenge. So we had a group of probably 100 or more institutional investors, sign on to a letter that went to the leadership of the House and the Senate about the importance to investors of the disclosures that have come out since the Dodd-Frank Act was passed, where obviously the companies are reporting on tin, tantalum, gold, tungsten in their supply chains and really getting down to the smelter level, et cetera. So next slide, please. In addition to that, I think there's an important dimension of, supporting the integration of human rights risk, criteria into investment decision making. So there'll be a kind of a work stream around building the capacity, skill development, assessing the key resources that need to be in play. The second here, the sharing of metrics, best practices, I think is going to be really essential. Let's face it, a lot of work still needs to be done on the metrics. Unlike setting, climate risk goals, let's say CO2 emissions, X number of percent between now and 5 years or 10 years from the baseline, it's a little harder to do that kind of metric around human rights issues. Although it's fair to say that if we combine metrics around, issues related to, as companies have monitored some of their human rights risks and human rights abuses in their supply chains, it's a question of incidents of noncompliance and how were they remediated. It can be a metric. However, the qualitative piece needs to be there as well. And one of the key questions are companies really using, like new technologies, to reach worker voice that they can actually, weigh in on some of the issues that they're experiencing and how is that affecting, compliance or performance change at the base level, a factory or a farm. And then also the integration of human rights into the engagements and all the various, ways that investors can influence publicly traded companies and policy will be a good piece of this. Next slide. So one of the central roles of the alliance is to assume that there are a whole range of investors, and we've heard from them, that are really wanting to get up to speed and to also utilize their current capacity along with other investors to move companies and to move policymakers in the human rights arena. And so I think that's going to be a tremendous opportunity. We'll be, really moving out to get other institutions, whether it be, the asset owners, asset managers, the public pension funds, the family funds, et cetera, to consider participating in this alliance and help to build it, because that's a key point in terms of getting in and helping to shape the different ways that this alliance can operate and fill some gaps that are currently there in this arena. Next slide. We have found historically that changes in corporate behavior and in policy are always aligned with community-based organizations, the way in which the non-governmental civil society is working on a variety of issues related to what's happening on the ground in terms of human rights, and then all the way to trade associations that have formed specific initiatives to address human rights issues. So it's really working in tandem with the other initiatives, other stakeholders that is going to make the alliance that much more effective. We've been doing this for a long time. However, an intentionality is really, really important. And I think it really helps then to maximize the collective impact that we are seeking. This isn't about really kind of trying to create another organization as much as a platform for more informed, more collective leverage and impact that can make a difference over time. Next slide. So for just to wrap up, if you have any questions, we'd love to get them. And I believe, Nicole, you'll be circulating the PowerPoint, et cetera. We are in the process of putting together a steering group. We will be sending out a fact sheet with a form if you're interested in joining the alliance. And I just feel like this network and the ICCR network, are so aligned on the issues of, where we want to move, whether it's a public pension fund, whether it's a university endowment or a foundation endowment, and to work together to figure out the best way to focus and to make substantive change, which is good for, obviously, the companies that are being held in the publicly traded arena of equity, but also to a whole range of workers and communities globally. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all so much for those wonderful presentations. Josh and Julie, if you could both go ahead and take yourselves off mute as well, we'll jump into some audience questions. And for the audience, please do continue to type your questions into the chat box in the control panel, and we'll get as many as we can. We've had a lot so far, and we only have about 10 minutes, so I'm going to try and string some questions together here. So starting broadly, in the ESG space, we've seen a lot of focus on the E and the G. So we've had a question about why you all think that the S has been more neglected. And I'm just going to try and tie that into a question about the Sustainable Development Goals and how your work relates to the SDGs, and since they've been released, if you've seen any shifts in the space.
So who would want to begin? This is David. Let me take just a sentence or two on the S. Couple things. One, what gets measured, gets managed is really key in the corporate world. And for a variety of reasons, the S has been more elusive. And I think it's for the reason that it's harder to measure. And I think earlier my comment about we need to couple the metrics with the qualitative analysis as well in this space. And as we get more familiar with that and we come to consensus around what are the key indicators that are essential in a given sector, or that's going to be important. I think the other is that let's just take a company we know so well, who, when they really established the environmental social governance model, it was all E, because E can easily cut costs out of business. You cut emissions. You cut your transportation distribution fleet in terms of the cost, and therefore the case can be made on an economic one alone. I think when it comes to S, people have seen that as that's where the cost is. You're investing more to have put systems in place to assess and address human rights violations. Also in terms of better wages, benefits, et cetera. And I think that's a kind of a short-term view. So as we look as investors to the longer horizon, where companies that are putting a lot more investments into some of the workplace human rights, particularly, pays off in terms of long-term productivity, et cetera. But I believe that the engagement of the investor community needs to grapple with this in terms of the short and long-term evaluations of companies. So that's a challenge that we need to face.
Can I just add 2 quick points to David's robust response? Just because one of the things is, I think, something that's coming down the pike more and more, because some of the reasons as many of you probably know, that the S is so challenging is it's hard to know in some cases when a community or when a worker is being impacted. And so some civil society organizations are really trying to figure out ways to get this kind of data and trying to figure this out. So I know, for example, Project ISRA, the ISRA Institute that's looking at forced labor in the seafood supply chain, and involves companies and civil society organizations, but they put hotlines into factories so that workers can directly report. So in cases the S is weak because it's not always well known when there are abuses. And the other thing, and I think this is changing, is companies' reluctance to report and wanting to be associated with human rights abuse. So companies have been, not been quick to try to report and share information. So I think those 2 things, have also kept the S down, but I think things are changing. A lot of mobile technology is being developed. Humanity United is working on some systems as well with mobile technology to give workers the voice and the power to report some of these things. So I think things are changing and going to improve.
Great, thank you.
Add on the element goals that they really create. There's opportunity and there's challenge there when it comes to human rights. Opportunity and goal to try and hold companies accountable, but challenges at the same time in that companies can use the SDGs to greenwash, and so our challenge as investors is to make sure that if we're using the SDGs to point companies to a goal, but that those goals are measurable and that we hold them to account.
That's a great point. So for those in the audience that only use external investment managers, do you have any advice on how to ensure that those managers are addressing these issues, and any recommendations for first steps listeners could take to increase engagement?
This is David. I would simply say the first and most important step, once the sort of the competence around the impacts of business on human rights is to make sure that the investor institution has alignment across the board. We find in some instances the social analysts who are working in one spot have a clear understanding of some of these issues, but then the buy and sell side is not connected to it. So I think there's much like what we ask of companies is to, mainstream, align human rights policy commitments across the board into the merchandising, into the buyers, as well as a responsible recruitment or a social sustainability person. I think that's important in terms of whatever the investment organization is, to make sure that the entire organization is on the same page.
This is Julie. Just building on some of what David was saying, I feel like if I understand the question right, if you have your money with a certain firm, I think it's a very reasonable and appropriate request to ask where are the greatest risks in the portfolio and in what sectors, and how has the firm determined that, and then what are they doing to address it? So are they engaging? Are they voting proxies? What is their proxy voting policy, as it relates to human rights resolutions that might come forward? And some of those managers, you could look to see if they're rated on Morningstar. You could look and see if they're PRI signatories, and if they are, they probably have a PRI report they've had to file. You can ask your manager to become a signatory, to join PRI, and to become part of some of those working groups that I mentioned on forced labor, for example. So I think, it's really up to all of us to talk to our investment firms. I know, like, where, I have some of my IRA money, I need to write to them too and ask them what they're doing. And I think, that just helps to raise awareness and make them realize, that these issues are important, but, they should be able to report to you back on these things.
And would you all say that this Investor Alliance for Human Rights is a possible resource that can help endowments address human rights issues at companies in their portfolios when they're strapped for time to do it themselves?
I would say absolutely. The Alliance will be a great opportunity for those investors that are interested in engaging on human rights, but are learning or looking for opportunities. There's going to be plenty of learning opportunities, but also plenty of opportunities for action, both that have sort of a low bar for involvement, such as sign-ons or participation in dialogues or even co-filing opportunities, as well as opportunities for investors that want to step up and become more involved in company engagements, multi-stakeholder initiatives, and other more time-consuming work. So there's a whole range of opportunities, and so I would certainly encourage any investors on the phone who are interested in upping their involvement in human rights to consider joining the Alliance.
And just one other word, the Alliance is really, it'll be obviously substantive, but it's a flexible platform. There's no fee or charge to become a member of the Alliance, and membership would mean some participation within some of the activities and actions of the Alliance, but the Alliance itself is not going to be acting on behalf of the investors. Rather, there'll be certain things that have been decided that'll move forward. So I think it's also, it's very important. It's certainly a learning hub. It's an action hub, and it's increasing leverage that can help the entire investment community, but specific tools for different aspects to the community as well. Because a family fund is not the same as a public pension fund, is not the same as a large asset management firm, et cetera. So we need to, invite participation of investors from all categories, and we're excited about, the opportunities to work together.
Wonderful. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time, but I would like to thank you, Josh, Julie, and David, again for this great information and discussion. And thank you to all of our participants for joining us this afternoon. I know we had a lot of unresolved questions from the audience, so I would encourage any of you that have further questions about the Investor Alliance for Human Rights this topic as a whole or other activities happening in the Intentional Endowments Network, to be in touch. All of our contact information is showing on the screen now. And again, this webinar will be up on our website shortly. So thank you all again so much, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Nicole.
Okay, take care.
Everybody.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.